to the University Interdisciplinary Colloquium. Thanks so much for joining us today. For those of you who are first-time attendees, this colloquium series is designed to provide humanists and artists with an opportunity to talk about interdisciplinary projects they're working on and to center the humanities and the arts as key contributors to meaningful, substantive interdisciplinary projects. The interdisciplinarity as a buzzword in the academy often is associated with the sciences, health sciences, STEM, and humanities and the arts tend to be marginalized if identified as players at all. And what we're trying to do with this series is provide those of you who are breaking new ground as humanists and artists in interdisciplinary combination a forum to talk about that work and to celebrate it. It's a series that's sponsored by the Center for Interdisciplinarity and the College of Arts and Letters. It meets every other week, well, except for this time. The next one's next week, but then after that I'll meet every other week again. Next week, Friday at this time, this place, Tamara Butler, who is Assistant Professor of Critical and Community Literacies in the Department of English and African American and African Studies, will deliver a presentation entitled Roots and Ruptures to Teach of Black Land, Literacies, and Placemaking. So that'll be next Friday in this room at noon. Also, the Center for Interdisciplinarity hosts a coffee hour after the University Interdisciplinary Colloquium. This convenes over in South Kedzie 523, which is the center's conference room, at 1:30. So the colloquium ends at 1, give everybody a chance to amble on over to South Kedzie if you want and have some coffee and basically what coffee and sweets are left over from the colloquium. But an opportunity to continue to talk about interdisciplinary topics, talk about the ideas that are shared in the colloquium, and it'd be great to have you join us if you have the time. Today we're really thrilled to have with us Professor Jacques Kaiser. Zach is an assistant professor of graphic design and experience architecture in the Department of Art History, and Design. He earned his undergraduate degree in graphic design from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and his MFA from the Massachusetts College of Art and Design. He regularly exhibits, publishes, and lectures widely, with recent presentations at Cambridge University and in the coffee country of Manizales, Colombia. And if he's not ranting about neoliberalism or the perils of technological optimization, he's probably somewhere looking at cat GIFs on Twitter. Today he's with us to deliver a talk entitled The Redistribution of the Sensible, Building an Interdisciplinary Interventionist Praxis. Zach.
Thanks, Michael. All right. Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. And thanks to Michael and Stephanie for inviting me to speak today. I have a little bit of a cold, so I'm sorry. I may, blow my nose or something at some point. I don't know, hopefully it won't be too awkward. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about a relatively simple idea, that the way we perceive our world determines how we participate in it. This is expressed elegantly, I think, by Jacques Rancière's phrase, the distribution of the sensible. In this context, sensible is what's apprehended by the senses. The distribution of the sensible sets the divisions between what's visible and invisible, sayable and unsayable, audible and inaudible. It determines what can be thought, made, or done. Distribution implies both inclusion and exclusion. Indeed, the distribution of the sensible serves to support the maintenance of the dominant social order and its attendant regimes of truth. For me, there are two important things to note about the distribution of the sensible and the way it structures our everyday lives. The first is that graphic design is a key participant, often unwittingly, in the distribution of the sensible. Now, I am by trade a graphic designer, and during my career in industry, I participated in the maintenance of the dominant social order, neoliberal capitalism and its accompanying systemic social inequalities, through the things I designed. I distributed the sensible for my users, rendering through images and typography the things that could be perceived and, in turn, the things that could not. Graphic design establishes the dominant regime of truth through the way it distributes the sensible. through the interfaces with which we interact every day, our Amazon wish lists, our Netflix queues, our Facebook profiles, our Nest thermostats, our Fitbits, etc., that which can be sensed, perceived, and therefore that which can be contested is constituted. Nowhere in your Fitbit dashboard, for example, do you see a visualization of the decisions about how the hardware determines what is a step and what isn't, what counts as signal and what counts as noise. More importantly, you don't see how such decisions, by establishing norms of activity, include some types of bodies while excluding others. Another example. If you're logged into your Amazon account and you look at your recent orders, you don't see the faces of the Amazon employees who packed and shipped those orders to you, nor do you see their hourly wages relative to the time it takes Jeff Bezos to earn what they earn in a day. This is why graphic design is so important. It guides us, allowing us to perceive some things while concealing others. It is always already political through its distribution of the sensible. This is especially the case in interface design, in which graphic design is connected both to computing as well as to assumptions about people and about the future. Assumptions made by developers, technologists, and business people, all of whom have certain interests and seek to maintain the privileging of those interests. If the design of our technologies is that which serves to distribute the sensible in everyday life, it also, of course, then presents maybe the best option for contesting the current distribution of the sensible, for redistributing it in a way that reveals the power dynamics at play in even the most mundane of technologies. In this way, design can show us the way towards a more just and equitable society. The other of the two important things to which I referred earlier is the work of Mark Fisher, and in particular his formation of capitalist realism and its connection to what he calls economic science fictions. These concepts bear much in common with Rancière's distribution of the sensible. Fisher's description of capitalist realism is relatively self-explanatory. It's the feeling that there is no alternative to capitalism, and that way that our imaginations are structured then by this feeling. Although the idea is simple, the way it comes to be is not. Fisher suggests that the economic and social science fictions within which we live are not necessarily written down. They appear as networks of disparate artifacts and utterances. The TED Talk, the patent filing, the industry insider listicle, the ad campaign. These discourses, always interpenetrated with graphic design, structure experience, producing a kind of ideological haze that is undetectable through traditional empirical methods. Fisher writes, economic and social science fictions always elude empiricism, since they are never given in experience. They are what structures experience. My work seeks to reveal the contours of the fictions within which we live that are legitimated by the current distribution of the sensible. Each project has a kind of conceptual structure that emerges both through scholarship and creative practice. It examines that which is concealed by the current distribution of the sensible, and in doing so seeks to reveal some part of the economic or social science fiction that structures experience and is legitimated through that distribution. It tries to illuminate the politics of this situation through a redistribution of the sensible. Zach, you might ask, as my students sometimes do, what is it that you are actually talking about? This is our Confused Brittany meme. Okay, part one, computing our dreams. Many of us use products like Fitbit or the Apple Watch that utilize sophisticated sensor technologies to tell us things about ourselves that we might otherwise not know. These technologies are part of a vast array of products that comprise the quantified self. But the products and services that quantify us and our behavior and purport to reveal insight about those selves are myriad and extend beyond our Fitbits and Apple Watches. And we often adopt variations on these technologies without necessarily ruminating on the kinds of ontologies they might imply. I mean, who has time for that, really? Me, maybe? In fact, I get frustrated, just like my students have told me they do, when my computational companions don't seem to know me as well as I think they should. When Netflix provides a stupid recommendation, or when Google Maps doesn't show me the thing that's clearly in my search history, et cetera, et cetera. Indeed, it's often taken for granted that computational products should be able to measure us accurately, not only in physiological, but in psychological terms. Hence, the wearable thermometer, Emberwave, is marketed as being able to control your moods by changing how hot or cool you feel. Medibio, meanwhile, a mental health technology company, claims to be identifying the link between physiologic measures and mental health, focusing primarily on data captured during sleep to purportedly determine a user's overall levels of depression, anxiety, stress, as well as their likelihood of suffering from bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. And Fast Company is eager to report the promise that an algorithm can tell if you're depressed just from your Instagram posts. With sleep tracking, this becomes particularly pronounced. Sleep tracking technologies can tell us how many hours we've slept, the relative depth of that sleep, based on, for example, heart rate and skin conductance, as well as the frequency, duration, and intensity of our movement. But they aspire to tell us about our interior lives through data. Apparently, we are in the golden age of the smart mattress, with older firms like Sleep Number competing with startups like 8 and others to sell beds with embedded sensors that can connect to an app to help users optimize their sleep with data-driven insights about when to go to bed and when to wake up. One might come to expect a tracker to accurately assess how sleep felt to them, the same way some expect spot-on recommendations from Netflix. But can sleep really be characterized by how long we've slept, or whether it was deep sleep or light sleep, according to, for example, your Sleep Number sleep IQ score? For many of us, sleep is defined by our dreams. And so far, tech companies have yet to figure out how to quantify them and, like everything else they measure, turn them into monetizable data. That's not to say that no one is trying. For example, the Gallant Lab at the University of California has been working on this front for over a decade, declaring in 2011 that quantitative modeling of human brain activity can provide crucial insights about cortical representations and can form the basis for brain decoding devices. That is, fMRIs can be used to essentially transcribe what the brain is seeing. Researchers claim that different kinds of brain activity correlate with visual representations of different objects. If we know what the brain is doing when it sees a specific thing like a bird, then we can infer that when similar brain activity is present, a subject is imagining, dreaming, or seeing a bird. Operating on those assumptions, the lab developed a machine learning algorithm to recreate imagery on the basis of brain patterns recorded while watching it, drawing from footage on YouTube. In 2017, using a similar process, researchers from Kyoto combined fMRI data with neural networks to produce images which they billed as having been decoded from brain activity. And then, of course, they posted those images on Twitter. Developing enough correlative data to accurately visualize the contents within our dreams seems pretty far off. However, as brain scanning machines get smaller and startups begin to innovate with these new developments, it seems plausible enough for CNN to ask, how close are we to video recording our dreams? The efforts to record dreams suggest that companies and researchers will seek ways to turn even our most inner sanctum into data, on the idea that it can better be known externally than experientially. Even if it remains a dream itself, the project of supposedly objective dream capture still accomplishes another goal, reinforcing the idea that we need trackers and data companies like Fitbit, Medibio, and 8 to tell us who we really are. What is the future of these attempts? And how did we come to think that machines could know us better than we know ourselves, even in our dreams? Enter Dr. Powell Norway. In the summer of 2014, two colleagues and I found Dr. Norway's 1841 treatise, Computable Transformations of Human Qualities to Those of a Visible Dream Memory, in a thrift store in Mangalia, Romania. His entire project, it seems, was about turning dreams into visuals. But this wasn't about interviewing subjects and then drawing. Instead, Norway had this idea about where dreams existed. He took a cue from the Cartesian conceptualization of the human, that the brain and body are wholly separate. He obsessed over this diagram from Descartes that illustrates a somatosensory pathway in the human through which pain molecules travel, effectively nerves, but he thought they were like hollow tubes. Perception of pain, argued Descartes, was completely brain-based. Norway was obsessed with Descartes, and after a week of particularly troublesome dreams, he wondered if maybe 200 years after Descartes, he could use the technology that his modern science training provided him to reinvigorate a corpuscular conceptualization of mind and body interactions. So he built this device and put it on himself. He spent months determining how to measure for what he deemed the Cartesian dream molecule. Eventually, he settled on a combination of temperature, movement, swelling, and moisture levels and assigned them the Greek letters alpha, beta, gamma, and chi. Experimenting on himself proved very difficult for a plethora of reasons, so he started recruiting subjects for the work. There wasn't a lot of enthusiasm for this, obviously, so he was usually able to convince a prostitute or drifter with a small bribe. He would measure their values before and after a brief nap, and he would then ask them to leave and put a pinch of laudanum, a popular opiate in Victorian times, into a glass of sherry and begin drawing. This is the type of image that he produced. We, that is, my colleagues Gabi, Sophie, and I, were taken by his strange work and immediately saw the parallels between his attempts to objectify subjective experience and contemporary attempts to quantify anything and everything about the self. So we decided to recreate Dr. Norway's experiments using modern-day, off-the-shelf consumer technology and custom sensors. Here you can see Aaron experiencing what we eventually decided to call the Dr. Powell Norway Dream Machine at our first performance of the piece at UC San Diego. Here's another view from the first installation of the project. I apologize for the washed out slides. It's sunny for the first time in like forever. After collecting a subject's biometric data, we processed it through our own proprietary dream interpreting algorithms, which visualize and sonify the properties of the subject's biometric data that correlate to the original things that Dr. Norway was trying to measure. A year after we premiered the project in San Diego, we were invited to work with a gallery in Philadelphia to perform the work again. This particular gallery space is massive. It's an old frozen fish warehouse. So in addition to performing the live demo of our reenactment of Dr. Norway's experience, we also created a self-guided version. So here, a user grabs an RFID-enabled chip from the wall in the lobby, and the user then enters 3 booths. Each booth is activated when a user places their chip on the shelf and initiates contact with a sensor. So in this situation, which is a little bit hard to see, we're taking the user's temperature. This is the galvanic skin response sensor that we used. And of course, we had an EEG headset, complete with an animation for people to teach them how to use it. After submitting their biometric data to all 3 booths, the visitors conclude their experience by checking in at the final station. After waiting for a few moments, they see a massive projection of their dream, which is not so massive on here. Sorry about that. This is some of like the output of the dream data capturing algorithms. All sorts of like really weird, wacky stuff. I think this is part of an episode of Family Guy that someone was dreaming about. This is a grid of a number of different dreams that we collected over the weeks that the exhibition was open. The exhibition was open for 6 weeks. Okay, so back to Dr. Powell Norway. He did not, as far as we know, exist. Nor did his Cartesian dream machine or the dream molecule. Or maybe put it a better way, he didn't exist as the single entity that we're presenting here. Rather, he's a fable of sorts, an amalgam of people like Francis Galton, Cesare Lombroso, and others, a result of our research on 19th century anthropometrics. When we present our exhibitions and performances, we don't reveal this. So now you're all in on the ruse, so don't tell anyone, right? I want to point out, however, that the responses from our audiences, while varying, have also been rather affective. In San Diego, one audience member was incredulous. She was a scientist, and she was incredulous that our dream output did not seem accurate enough for her. She said, "I did not dream about that last night." She yelled at us. In Philadelphia, we were heckled by someone who was angry at us for suggesting that so-called subjective dream data could ever be extracted from the subject to begin with. His exact term was, quote, "bullshit," end quote, which he screamed at us repeatedly. I think the affective responses to the faux historical and technological parts of the project are indicative of its potential to open a new kind of space that questions the assumptions embedded in quantified self-technologies. This is a kind of redistribution of the sensible that shakes 2 aspects of the quantified self-tech into the foreground, aspects which are typically concealed by the current distribution of the sensible. One of those is history. Now, to have the time to go through all the histories embedded within quantified self-tech would require us to have at least a semester together, and I wish the dean was here to hear this. And we don't. But as a side note, I've proposed a course on the politics of the quantified self, either as an IAH course or as a collaboration with the med school, and I'm really looking forward to getting something like that going. Just a plug for the camera. I think a few historical vignettes might help, though. As we know from our pal Foucault, the transition from a disciplinary society to a society that exerts a kind of productive power and control on its population begins in earnest in the late 19th century, in the early days of statistics, with what Ian Hacking calls the taming of chance. The project to tame chance, the idea that everything operates probabilistically, and therefore it's possible to tame chance programmatically via the quantification of all aspects of everyday life, has continued in what is often a very strange and dynamic history that runs parallel to the various iterations that capitalism itself has undergone. The taming of chance, the prediction and control of various populations such that the maintenance of state power and the hegemony of capitalism is maintained, has been, especially over the last century, predicated on a new kind of intimacy between data and world that we can trace back to P.W. Bridgman's 1927 book, The Logic of Modern Physics, in which he coins the verb to operationalize. Bridgman writes, "We mean by any concept nothing more than a set of operations. The concept is synonymous with the corresponding set of operations. This is the core of operationalism, which is based on the intuition that we do not know the meaning of a concept unless we have a method of measurement for it. Operationalism is simultaneously a dogmatic commitment to method as well as to measurement. The combination of these commitments might sound familiar. It's built into today's popular data-infused parlance as metrics or analytics." Stanley Aronowitz provocatively writes, "Are data and a world the same thing? One of the central claims of positivism is that the translation of the world and all of the complexity and empirical richness that it implies into data is a valid operation. Bridgman's Logic of Modern Physics introduced the term to operationalize to the social sciences to describe this process. This translation permits the data to be regarded as representing the world so that a researcher's findings can then be easily generalized back to the world. When properly accomplished, however, this translation need no longer be considered part of the process." Despite the fact that Bridgman's original intent, a radically individualist brand of empiricism, was wildly misinterpreted, the concept of operationalism had a tremendous influence across the sciences. George Rosenwald, professor of psychology at the University of Michigan, emphasized Bridgman's role in the history of science, especially the field of psychology. Bridgman's operationalist philosophy could hardly have shaped the course of psychological research more thoroughly or enduringly. Rosenwald argues, ironically, the result of a commitment to operationalism in the social sciences is an increase in technical knowledge without any increase in understanding of what he called real life. He writes, "In brief, because we wish to urgently gain mastery over pressing human perplexity, we are untiring in the pursuit of adequate operationalizations. And because we are relatively sophisticated about these perplexities, we tend to reject most of the attempted solutions as inadequate. This is why there's never enough data, and why the answer to inaccuracy always seems to be the capture of more data, which requires ever more incisive modes of surveillance." Indeed, the process of operationalizing data is the bedrock for the other thing that gets concealed by the current distribution of the sensible in quantified self-products and services: the functioning of the hardware and software of the technologies themselves. Illustrative of the translations that produce an equivalence between data and world is the MEMS 3-axis accelerometer, a computational instrument that serves to make particular phenomena observable. It's the kind of technology, along with other similar technologies, with which graphic designers work without ever even knowing it. The MEMS accelerometer is one of the sensors inside of a Fitbit. It's used to measure the acceleration in all three directions of a user's arm. These measurements are used to establish different kinds of movements or non-movements of a user. Fitbit uses, to the best of my knowledge, a combination of two femto MEMS accelerometers. The femto refers to the femtometer, which is a very tiny unit of length. The accelerometer uses the femtometer as a measure of movement of a small mass inside the accelerometer. This mass is called the proof mass. An optomechanical accelerometer, such as the early femto ones around 2012, works by sending a laser through an optical cavity between two tiny rails, one of which is attached to the proof mass. As the proof mass moves, the size of the gap between the rails changes. This causes tiny deformations in the reflection of the laser, which in turn changes the intensity of the laser as it bounces back and forth. These changes are detected as vibrations, which are likely measured in kilohertz. Using a standard equation, the vibration measurements are converted into voltage. The voltage is then converted into binary using another equation, and it is then sent out of the accelerometer as digital signals using either the SPI or the I2C protocols. In both protocols, particular patterns of ones and zeros signify either measurements or commands to the microcontroller, like the Fitbit, to which the accelerometer is connected. Holy cow. The Fitbit microcontroller then converts the digital signal from the accelerometer using another equation into the kinds of measurements output by its application programming interface. These measurements, for developers of the new Fitbit Watch OS, include numerical data in meters per second squared. Acceleration. It's difficult to, these measurements of acceleration and vibration are then put through yet another series of equations. And it's difficult to tell what happens here because this is part of Fitbit's proprietary sort of fine-tuned algorithm. But at long last, they finally output a counting of steps. The likelihood is that Fitbit's algorithm compares the input data to sample input data based on a model of how normal people on average take steps. In other words, at least 4 different sets of equations are combined to take something as simple as a step and allow the Fitbit device itself to count it as a step. Even then, it may not count as a step depending on how the input data matches to the model being used. But counting steps is still quantitative, and we're not even yet discussing the translation of qualitative phenomena into quantitative measures. Even still, there are a number of translations needed to take one kind of counting, the steps you take, and translate it into an accurate digital output that's expressed through an interface. Such processes become even more abstracted when we think about something like the Sleep Number Smart IQ, or Sleep IQ mattress, smart, whatever, all those words. The advanced biometric sensors in the Sleep Number Smart mattress are proprietary, but it's likely that they are variations of piezoelectric sensors and accelerometers that detect vibrations both from breathing and from tossing and turning, which are different types and different magnitudes of vibration. Translations of data through various equations, likely similar to those of the accelerometer and microcontroller of a Fitbit, are only part of the process of developing a model of good sleep, which allows companies to give a user a sleep score. Computational models, whether those are models of how humans walk or how they sleep, have assumptions about people embedded within them. These assumptions are often founded on averages and standard deviations and have their roots in the early days of statistics and our pals Quetelet and Galton. In order to give a user a sleep score, a numerical definition of good sleep is needed, which is predicated on assumptions about how humans sleep. In this example, data only becomes equal to world not merely when filtered through an incredible number of equations and transformations, but also when it's situated within an array of assumptions about the relationship between people, the vibrational data they produce when sleeping, and the substantive quality of their individual sleep itself. Now let us return to this idea of the relationship between data and world. This relationship has emerged as an equivalence and not a mediated translation. The mechanisms of this translation, the equations that construct the models, the assumptions that underpin the technologies and the technological innovations themselves, such as the accelerometer, are made to disappear, particularly in the products and services for which graphic designers create interfaces. This disappearance is a kind of distribution of the sensible, and it has profound consequences. But before we talk about those consequences, I'm going to take a drink of water and turn to something near and dear to our hearts, the Faculty Activity Information System. Part 2, computing our faculty. Just like the other distributions of the sensible I've already talked about, FAIS is an interface that both reveals and conceals. It helps shape the contours of our ideas about what it means to participate in a learning community, but maybe in a different way than the other interfaces I've described. It's not colorful or fun, right? We might suggest it belongs to a category of design not unlike the technical documentation of the accelerometer I just showed you. That category is what Matthew Fuller and Andrew Goffey call gray media. Fuller and Goffey's gray media includes enterprise-level group work software, company intranet platforms, database systems, and other managerial and organizational tools. Gray media possess, they say, a sleek affectation to effectlessness. I love that phrase. They write, the unobtrusive grayness of so many types of media practice, from sysadmin to data gathering or the control and verification of all sorts of qualities and attributes, calls for a kind of suspicious attentiveness. They say not that gray media are the bearers of some sort of hidden meaning that might be brought to light, but a certain recessiveness is often a crucial aspect of their efficacy, and it is that which makes them of practical interest. In other words, gray media recede into the background of existence, and this is how they do their work. They don't call attention to themselves. Gray media are especially tricky when it comes to their function in the distribution of the sensible, because they often go unnoticed. As we all well know by now, we live and work here within a capitalist realist institution that seeks to optimize all of its resources, including its faculty, in order to demonstrably maximize its return on investment. The FAIS, along with corporations such as Academic Analytics, to which we have a subscription, Summative, and a new company called ScholarStat, are all part of this effort. Summative's academic solution, for example, provides a platform for the engagement of management, academics, non-academic staff, and students in the performance of their university. Their workload allocation management system is a comprehensive planning and reporting tool, and perhaps most importantly, a proven communication platform that will manage the process of delivering your workload model fairly to each and every individual. It provides faculties, departments, and schools with quick, simple inputs to deliver complex, highly defined processes, and it's integrated with Summative Living Review and Summative Goals to provide a holistic approach to personal as well as organizational development. Meanwhile, we're more familiar with this one, Academic Analytics boasts to aggregate, curate, visualize, and contextualize data on the research created by scholars and provide powerful, user-friendly business intelligence tools to visualize and identify patterns from those data. They help senior administration view research faculty in an appropriate context, win funding, and increase the visibility of the institution's research enterprise to foundations, companies, and collaborators. ScholarStat, meanwhile, might suggest the future of these platforms. It combines biometric data from various sensors, voice recognition, natural language processing, sentiment analysis, physical interfaces in faculty offices, and a digital platform to create what they suggest is a holistic approach to understanding faculty productivity. This approach, they argue, of course, also dovetails with wellness programs and other university initiatives that blend personal and professional life seamlessly. There's one other recent development that I think is pertinent here. It's not a company, but rather a study called Tenure Analytics, Models for Predicting Research Impact, published in 2015 in the journal Operations Research. The authors, not surprisingly from MIT's Sloan School of Management, suggest the following. Tenure decisions, key decisions in academic institutions, are primarily based on subjective assessments of candidates, and that analytics can complement the tenure decision-making process in academia and improve the prediction of academic impact, implying, of course, that the bibliometric database they use to train their prediction models is somehow objective. In a promotional piece on Sloan's website titled Moneyball for Academia, the authors suggest that predictive analytics are the future of hiring and tenure decisions, completely optimizing the academy. If we look back at the ScholarStat platform, I'd suggest that it presents two key tendencies that are indicative of the direction that accountability programs in academia are headed. Holistic or systems-oriented evaluations that consider factors that affect productivity and not just productivity itself. Such systems might include metrics for the evaluation of teaching as well as research. Indeed, ScholarStat recommends the integration of sensors and biometrics into the classroom as indicators of teaching efficacy. Second, the use of predictive analytics and recommendation systems for scholarship and productivity, which become increasingly enmeshed in institutional infrastructure, ranging from promotion and tenure decisions to intranet applications, etc. Cybernetics is at the root of the university's surrender to capitalist realism. Every aspect of the university, individual professors, students, departments, whole colleges, become information processors seeking to optimize themselves and perfectly optimizable. Many of the underlying assumptions about the university as a system connected to other systems, such as the economy or the microbiome of an individual faculty member, come from cybernetics. Norbert Wiener defined it in his seminal 1948 volume Cybernetics as the scientific study of control and communication in the animal and machine. Or as Orit Halpern puts it, cybernetics is a science of control or prediction of future events and actions. The long history of cybernetics is complex, but I'll venture to describe a few key elements that again are concealed in the design of FAIS. Cybernetics has its origin in the ideas of prediction and control that crystallized in the military technology of World War II. Developed and first articulated by Wiener at MIT, it holds that everything can be described as an information processing system. Furthermore, it holds that feedback is an essential part of that system, and given the right feedback at the right time, a system can self-regulate. For systems to function perfectly, whether that means a thermostat can maintain a room at a given temperature or an anti-aircraft gun can predict the location of its target, the right information must reach the right part of the system at the right time in a form that can be understood by that part of the system. This ability for parts of the system, humans or machines, to communicate with one another underpinned the early commitment of cybernetics to the language of mathematics and the insistence on quantifying certain phenomena that previously seemed unquantifiable entirely. The military-industrial complex, with its nexus at MIT, it turns out, also figures largely in the history of bibliometrics, the field of quantifying and assessing the impact of research output or written publication. In 1954, less than a decade after Wiener coins the term cybernetics, Eugene Garfield proposed the Science Citation Index, or SCI. His original design was intended to make literature searches easier. Garfield, inspired by the work of Norbert Wiener's boss, Vannevar Bush, dreamed of a way that scientists could more quickly and easily access information. Once the index was completed, though, it started to make sense not as a way to search for scientific information, but as a way to rank scholars. Rankings of scholars based on general reputation, however, have existed since the 1870s. With increasing disciplinary specialization and major scientific advances, along with the proliferation of publication outlets, by the 1930s, managing a single directory of prominent scholars became impossible. And by the mid-1970s, Garfield and Irving Scher then introduced the journal impact factor as a way to help normalize citation counts at the journal level, as a way to help identify journals to be included in the SCI. But it turned into a widely misused shortcut for attaching a crude score to the scientific merit of journals and even individual papers and authors. In 1992, the SCI and sister indexes were merged into the Web of Science portal, and in 2017, the Web of Science was acquired by Clarivate Analytics. The development of the SCI and the JIF spurred a number of other indices which have reached ubiquity, including the H-index and eigenfactor score, as well as the scores academic analytics gives to us. Once the purpose of the SCI and JIF became assumed to be the evaluation of scholars and not the enhancement of literature searches, questions about how to achieve this assumed purpose and if these crude metrics were actually doing it arose, without, of course, questioning the assumption of the original purpose in the first place. Once it becomes assumed that the ranking and evaluation of scholars' impact is helpful to assess the return on investment of the human capital of a university, all kinds of questions arise about the SCI and JIF, which lead then to a proliferation of metrics and metametrics. So they began to integrate the context of citations into quantitative systems. And then, understanding the flaws of relying on citation data alone, the scientific community saw other indicators of impact. This led to the disambiguation of citations and references, and then the networked nature of the web became a metaphor for scholarship, which led to social indicator mining, beginning with text mining of acknowledgments and articles. As bibliometrics became a tool for ranking and evaluation, the impetus to more fully describe the impact of a scholar or journal predominated, which led to the proliferation of metric systems to capture as much data as possible. By 2010, we saw the emergence of altmetrics, which view social media and other networked interactions as offering a richer or more granular picture of impact. As cybernetics gave birth to today's advanced computation, the commingling of researchers within MIT's military academic industrial complex also laid the groundwork for another totalizing theory of existence. David Columbia calls this ideology computationalism, by which he means a commitment to the view that a great deal, perhaps all, of human and social experience can be explained via computational processes. Columbia sees the beginning of computationalism emerging from Noam Chomsky's early work in formal linguistics, which he did at MIT in the 1950s, interacting with many of the early cyberneticists. This work posits the mind as a sophisticated computer and suggests a universal set of rules for the production of human language. While the need for a uniform language through which information can be transmitted between parts of a system is acknowledged in cybernetics, computationalism takes this need and turns it into an assumption. That indeed, if everything can be explained by computational processes, then we may as well assume that everything is computational in nature. Adopting a computationalist view of the world, and specifically of faculty members, legitimizes the metrics by which impact is assessed and indeed equates those very metrics with the qualitative notion of impact itself. This is precisely the issue I began to examine in 2016 with a video piece called Our Program, which premiered at a conference for design educators. I designed and built what is effectively a stock ticker for someone's academic analytics scores, and that became a central character in a video piece that sought to examine the future of faculty metrics technologies. ScholarStat emerged out of that video. Indeed, just like Dr. Powell Norway, ScholarStat is a parafiction. The company recently published an advertorial in an issue of Art Journal. Now, our journal is the flagship publication of the College Art Association, the main professional society of most art faculty across the country, and boasts a circulation of 35,000. The whole idea of an advertorial, that our journal would somehow need that content as part of its revenue, would be, I imagine, repugnant. ScholarStat suggests a more coherent and integrated system of quantification than currently exists for faculty, just like Dr. Paul Norway's Dream Machine did for dreaming, and extrapolates a near future based on current tendencies and technological developments. I've used ScholarStat and the ticker from our program as a way to remove the grayness from the gray media of things like FAIS. This is a way for me of redistributing the sensible, attempting to suggest tendencies by pushing them towards a semi-absurd but more visual conclusion. By rendering the gray media of scholarly metrics more tangible, I've enabled myself also to produce projects that push against it. For example, I created a piece of software called Citation Bomb. This software approaches the citation as a commodity and attempts to devalue it. A user, presumably an academic working on a paper, opens the software and enters the name of a paper they've cited. The software then queries Google Scholar and finds the top 10 related papers. The citations for these papers are output as a Word document in 4-point white text. The software then prompts the user to copy and paste this into the references section of the paper on which they are working. When the user's paper is finally posted, Google Scholar will eventually index this paper and its citations, possibly including the hundreds in white because its algorithms comb the text of the paper, not just what is visible. By creating a system that extends a paper's citations to the papers and books that those papers and books cited, and then again, a systematic overflowing of citation counts can be created, such that Google's ability to measure impact via citation counts plummets, forcing us, one hopes, to reckon with our reliance on those metrics. In attempting to flood the citation market and devalue it as a commodity, the project aims to create a crisis of academic accountability. The likelihood is, however, this project is more symbolic than tactical. Google Scholar's algorithms probably have some way to track average numbers of citations and flag papers that fall outside the norm, and actual change would require thousands of academics to use it regularly. But I wonder if the gesture can create a momentary pause that allows the assumptions underpinning life in the capitalist realist university to sort of seep into the foreground. I love air quotes, you guys know that. I feel like my work can kind of catalyze the discourse I want it to, mostly when I'm in conversation with other people about it. So the scholarly component of all this stuff is really important to me. I've given a number of talks and done some writing on the history of scholarly metrics and the future of higher ed, and I think that aspect of my practice is really valuable. So I just want to offer some concluding thoughts on the computable subjectivity as an aspirational ideal. It's strange that we would rely on data and machines to reveal ourselves to us, given even that the most rudimentary measurement technologies are often flawed. For example, my pal Gabi recently described his experience with the Zozo suit, a spiffy spandex bodysuit that's supposed to generate personalized sized clothing, but which resulted for him in jeans that were comically ill-fitting. When this kind of service fails, the difference between the potentially inaccurate computed version of ourselves and our physical body is obvious, though Zozo is eager for feedback to get better. But when it comes to sizing up the nature of our dreams or the impact of our work, it can be harder to see how the computed self differs from our qualitative but amorphous sense of ourselves. If products like the Zozo suit will eventually work, who's to say that our future academic metric interfaces or a dream reading smart pillow won't? In all of these cases, computational products work on us rather than for us, selling us a fiction about subjectivity, that we are completely machine readable or at least should aspire to be. Any kind of digital tracker, whether it's measuring our waist size or our dreamscape, sells users on this idea. And what's more, just like in the examples of sleep tracking technologies, as well as in the case of scholarly metrics, to suggest that someday we will be able to gather enough data to see people's dreams or completely evaluate impact is to assume an equivalence between data and world. This assumption enables a computationalist view of the social and mental life of people, and it is this ideology that becomes naturalized through the way our technologies distribute the sensible, especially through their design. Once the equivalence between world and data is established, computationalism can take root. It not only sits at the core of our devices, but it comes home to roost in our bedrooms, the office, and in the gym. As we come to know ourselves more and more through these interfaces, we come to know ourselves as computable and computing. we adopt what I call a computable subjectivity, an understanding of the entire mental and physical life of the self and any activity in which that self might engage as completely legible to computational systems and composed of nothing but machine-readable data. The Zozo suit and the dream-reading smart pillow are part of the fictional systems that Mark Fisher argues generate the individual subject as a special effect, positioning the computable subjectivity as an aspirational ideal. They promise the possibility of optimizing every aspect of ourselves and implicitly making it more productive: our sleep patterns, our eating habits, our Netflix cues, our research, and our dreams. Not only is the computable subject ideally suited to be the entrepreneurial self par excellence, but it is, as Mark Fisher argues, an effect of the hegemonic fiction of capitalist realism. When our imagination is dominated by these ideas, we seek what Ulrich Beck calls biographical solutions to systemic contradictions. In other words, instead of trying to change the system, we try to adapt our lives to it. We accept that risk must be privatized so that individual consumers can optimize their individual lives in their own self-interest, and no collective or collaborative alternatives are possible. We may be becoming more susceptible to a certain kind of incisive biopolitical control, but not because some evil genius has cooked up new wearable tech. In a sense, we ourselves are both the evil geniuses and an effect of them. Our subjectivities emerge from the economic science fictions we inhabit, reproducing and reinscribing their neoliberal ideologies and establishing the boundaries of our imaginations and experiences, perpetuating the cycle. This analysis demonstrates, to my mind, a desperate need to redistribute the sensible in order to reveal the economic science fictions that structure reality, that shape our imaginations. How else can we identify new possibilities? Without it, the whole idea of innovation is actually quite its opposite, serving exclusively to maintain the status quo, which, in the times in which we live, is completely unacceptable. I want finally and briefly to touch on the value of interdisciplinarity in this endeavor. I think that to redistribute the sensible requires a serious questioning of the pre-constitution of disciplines and the criteria for judgment that those disciplines hold dear. If we look at the history of design, for example, its codification as an academic discipline is accompanied by an epistemic closure. In order to reimagine what it's capable of doing, we must blow the doors off of it. And to do so is only possible in a place like MSU with the help of folks like the C4I. One last thing. I've made the suggestion before. There aren't enough people here for it to really matter, and I really wish the dean was here. But one small act that I think we can engage in, or maybe a large act, in order to begin redistributing the sensible for ourselves and others inside and outside MSU is to boycott the FAIS for 1 year and instead spend the day FAIS is due giving presentations to each other and the community about our work, a university-wide celebration of learning. We don't need to be artists and designers to begin to unshackle ourselves from the economic science fictions that are legitimated by the distribution of the sensible that hold us hostage. In redistributing the sensible for ourselves and one another, we may yet be free. Thanks. Sorry, I was a little long there, Michael. I apologize.
We have some time for questions. I'd like to, if you don't mind, to have you use this microphone, not to amplify your voice, but just to record your voice for the recording that we're making for the web. So if you don't mind, raise your hand and I'll let you use this. Questions for Zach?
Mark.
Hi, Zach. That was brilliant, and I'm not surprised. And of course, very provocative. And I don't have anything specific to say because it's shattered everything that I've been thinking about. And I particularly enjoyed or got that you brought it into the FAIS, questioning the FAIS system. I think we all hate filling out those forms. And in terms of the history as well, the operationalize, is that basically, is the idea, the assumption that's made by in operationalizing is that there's no, how would you put it, that there's no, it's completely translatable, the reality and data are completely translatable?
Totally. But what's really interesting, I mean, so the whole idea of operationalism got really misunderstood. Like, Bridgman, his original argument was basically that it came out of a response to Einstein's special relativity theory. Basically, Bridgman said, okay, there's no uniform measurement for length anymore. That's out. So the whole first half of this book is like a case study on the idea of length. And he basically says, okay, if there's no measurement for length anymore, then we need more specific terms to describe length, and we need specific operations to measure length. So actually, like, his original formulation of this was like kind of nuanced in a really weird way, but that's also kind of reminiscent of companies that suggest that like we need to capture we just need to capture more data and it'll be more
I was
accurate.
just wondering, just to interrupt you, sorry.
Yeah, don't worry.
In terms of what was it called, the
femtometer.
Femtometer.
Yeah.
It would be interesting to connect the two.
It's exactly what he was talking about.
Right.
Yeah, like, I mean, I don't think he had that access
Right.
to that sort of tininess back
Right.
then. But also, I mean, so I started thinking about this in the context of a book called, oh man, I don't even remember what it's called. It's about how empiricism and rationalism kind of come together in computing technologies that allow us to observe the world in a new way. And it's like, I think Bridgman's work is a strong precursor of that.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Marcos, you want to say something?
No, I feel kind of forced now. I'm just also processing everything. Also because lately I've started to research pretty similar things, but I'm actually investigating how deep
Yeah.
learning can relate to post-truth politics through
Yeah.
deepfake use, to talk about politics in relation to HIV stigma. But what you really made me think a lot, because when I got here, you were talking about those sleep meters, and I just recently read Jonathan Crary's 24/7. I think the subtitle of the book is Late Capitalism and the Ends of Sleep.
Yeah.
And he's precisely talking about a colonization of sleep that also might come out of these technologies and the knowledge that might come out of this. And this is just super scary.
Yeah. The deepfakes thing is kind of interesting too. Like, you could imagine a flipped scenario where we attempt to stimulate our brains in particular ways in order to generate specific images. You know, like if we can look at brain activity and understand from that activity what images someone might be seeing, then like, couldn't you conceivably stimulate brain activity in a particular way, such as to produce images?
And control even our sleep in some way.
Yeah.
Yeah, it also got me thinking a lot while you're talking how much the algorithm or coding or any artificial intelligence is also subjective, because it's made by someone, so their own inputs are there. And that takes me back to the first examples of deep learning experiments in the Silicon Valley, in which like a computer would see Manet's Olympia and say that that's a burrito, just because of the shape of it.
Totally.
Or even understand African Americans as an ape.
Yep.
So that just shows how biased also these processes are, and how important it is to bring it back to some sort of reality, whatever that is. And I think that Rancière is amazing to do that.
Yeah.
And coincidentally, I also come off Rancière for my documentary practice.
Yeah.
And for his idea of dissensus as a way of, through art, changing or contributing to the sharing of the sensible. This idea that we have to create conflicts of meaning, which is, for me, what you did with your piece. When you get all that data and materialize it and create a kind of bug with its meanings and functions. I love it. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Marcos. Stephanie, is that you back there?
Have Christian and
So I have a question about whether or not you've thought about doing one of these, let's call them fictional scenarios, with some of the size scales that we haven't achieved with things yet, right? Like, all I can think about is when I was a PhD student working on nanotechnology, and everyone thought I worked on iPod Nanos because it was like the prevalent thing that everyone saw, and you're talking about the femtomems situation. So have you thought about like creating a fictitious scientist who came up with like the zeta whatever something something, and then playing
That
with like,
absolutely
size
hasn't crossed my
scales.
mind, but I love it. That's amazing. But now we all know about it, so we're
Yeah,
like,
we just gotta
keep it in this
keep
room.
it in the room.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was really fascinating. I mean, I work from a philosophical perspective on some of these underlying dynamics that you have mentioned. I wonder how you see this connection. I mean, I think ultimately, do you think you can bring it back to sort of like a meta-analysis of the capitalist dynamics, of which, of course, most elements that you mentioned, the fetishization, the naturalized ideology, the redistribution of the sensible is clearly already in the German ideology and Marx, where you have this idea that, of course, the social practices constantly change the perceptual world. And I think the problem is somehow that it seems to all go back to what maybe I would call three major abstractions in modernity. Namely, in modern philosophy, you have this idea that we can find an absolutely abstract concept of the self. That's, so to speak, the Cartesian tradition. And then we have the second abstraction happens in economics, where you can take Marx's value concept, which, so to speak, is the idea that you can formalize every entity via economic value. And the third is the mathematization of nature through the natural sciences. And if you take these three together, then you have, so to speak, this mega dynamics that's behind all of that. But I wonder, do you see any way to get this together with these concrete research projects that you have? Because, you know, from my perspective, I would always say, okay, we can, of course, come up with these interventionist practices, and I find this, of course, more than important, and I find especially your counter projects very interesting, but as long as we don't find a way to really tackle what's happening on this meta level, of course, to which not everyone agrees, by the way, but I mean, as long as we cannot tackle this, it seems to remain insufficient.
I would say, maybe inappropriately here at a research institution, I would say the place to do it is the classroom. I would say that like our students are the people who are indoctrinated with certain, like, I mean, it's not even indoctrination. I mean, we're talking about the way that their sensible is distributed for them. And I think that if we can, in classroom practices, illuminate some of the things that you're talking about and connect it with like really concrete experiences that they're having. I mean, we talk all the time in class about like Fitbit and Amazon, like all these things. I think the classroom space is a really rich terrain to like try to poke and prod at some of these things. And I think we can, I mean, I don't want to say, I think we can sneak practical sort of like real world knowledge into those sort of more theoretical discussions without, and maybe optimistically, without detracting from the real like intellectual work that I think needs to be done. So I think that like teaching to me is the best space to have an effect at scale. Like I would say I teach more students. I mean, a lot of people don't go to galleries, and you're already preaching to the choir kind of when you get people to like go to a gallery show. So I kind of feel like meeting students in the classroom and having these kind of conversations there is sometimes a really productive way to approach it. I don't know, that's like the best answer I have right now. Yeah.
So thanks, that was fantastic. And it explains a lot about some of our own conversation. And the examples of the stuff that, the Zozo and stuff like that, I gotta note that apparently everybody says it's ill-fitting and hideous. The jeans that you get, the suit and wear that.
Yeah, it like doesn't work, yeah.
So I'm fully committed along with you to resisting the transition or the sort of the switch of the quantification of nature for the life world in the Husserlian sense. And like that runs amok with everything that happens in the real world. But it seems to me that like I'm not exactly sure how to ask the question, but like, what do we do then? Like quantification itself is part of the real world itself.
Oh yeah.
So how do we deal with quantification? Do we resist its inappropriate application to non-quantifiable events? Do we, that seems like the big sort of thing happening. Like cybernetics, like these guys were involved in the creation of the computer, and it's
Right.
like, but what do you do once computers now exist? Because it turns out that we can actually quantify parts of human thinking, mainly the math part.
You know, amazing. This is such a good question. I think it's part of the reason I texted you a while back about the like trying to differentiate like mathematical approaches from programmatic approaches. Like I've been really grappling with that, and I don't understand. I don't have enough of a philosophy background to like. I'm better, I think, at some kind of like some theory stuff and some sort of like contemporary tech stuff, and like I don't have all the philosophical background that you do. So one thing that I keep thinking about, honestly, is the political economic context in which the work is being done. So like the work of quantification doesn't happen in a vacuum. And so I think that being aware of the politics and economics that are the dynamics that exert some kind of influence on quantification, you know, is probably the best place to start. And I think that also that has a kind of like, Marx has his flaws, but I think thinking about some of this stuff through a like Marxist capital, you know, volume, maybe like start with one lens, especially with students, I think is actually a really maybe good place to be, just kind of like begin that conversation. That's, yeah. Cool, thanks guys.